Welcome to Godless and Grounded.
Imagine you are standing in a massive stone cathedral in the year 1200. The air is thick with incense, the windows are glowing with stained glass, and the priest is standing at the far end of the hall speaking in a language you don't understand. For the average person back then, the gospel wasn't a book you read at home. It was a sensory experience, but something fundamental changed over the centuries. We moved from a culture of deep, meditative sound and ritual into a culture of the written word, and eventually we landed in our modern world where sound has returned to replace the gospel once again, but in a completely different way. When we talk about the gospel, we are talking about good news. Historically, this was meant to be a set of specific claims about history, morality, and the divine. It was a message that required logic, literacy, and a certain level of intellectual engagement once the printing press made Bibles available to everyone. But before people could read, religion was purely about sound. It was the ringing of bells and the vibration of a pipe organ that made your chest rattle. These sounds weren't just background noise, they were designed to bypass your brain and go straight to your nervous system. They were meant to make you feel something transcendent without you having to understand a single sentence of theology. As an atheist or a skeptic, you might look at this and see a very clever psychological trick. If you can't convince someone with a logical argument because they are illiterate or because the argument itself doesn't hold water, you can still overwhelm their senses. This is where the shift began. In the modern era, we have seen a massive decline in traditional religious adherence, but we haven't seen a decline in the desire for that sensory overwhelm. We've traded the church organ for the concert stadium speakers and the podcast host's voice. Sound has replaced the gospel because sound is easier to consume than truth claims. Think about how a modern megachurch works. If you strip away the electric guitars, the fog machines, and the heart-tugging chord progressions played softly under the sermon, what is left? Usually, it's a series of very thin, logically inconsistent claims that wouldn't stand up to 5 minutes of actual scrutiny. The sound is doing the heavy lifting. It creates an emotional high that the brain misinterprets as a spiritual truth. This is a huge pivot in human history. We used to argue about the literal translation of Greek manuscripts. Now, people choose their faith based on which worship band has the best production value. Sound has become the authority because sound doesn't require you to think. It only requires you to feel. Let's look at the history of how we got here. In the early days of the Christian movement, the word was everything. But as the church grew into a political powerhouse, it realized that the common person didn't need to know the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. They needed to be kept in awe. They used acoustics to create a godlike environment. If you've ever walked into a cathedral and felt a sense of hush, that isn't magic. It's architecture designed to manipulate sound waves. The long reverb times in those old buildings meant that speech became blurry, but music became heavenly. It was a deliberate choice to prioritize the feeling of the divine over the understanding of the message. Fast forward to the Enlightenment. Literacy rates go up. People start reading the texts for themselves. They start noticing the contradictions, the historical inaccuracies, and the moral failures within the pages. This was a crisis for the gospel. When people started using their eyes instead of just their ears, the whole system started to shake. For a while, the word was under the microscope. But in the last 100 years, we have circled back to the beginning. We are now in a post-literate society in many ways. We consume our information through TikTok, YouTube, and podcasts. We are back to being a hearing culture. The danger here is that sound is the perfect delivery vehicle for misinformation. When someone speaks with a confident, booming voice or uses a soothing, ASMR-style tone, our brains are wired to trust them more. We are suckers for a good frequency. Religions have mastered the art of the sonic environment. They know that if they can get the bass frequencies right, they can trigger a physical response in your body that feels like the spirit moving, but is actually just your vagus nerve reacting to a low-end vibration. In a world where the gospel, the actual literal text, is becoming harder and harder for the modern mind to accept as fact, sound has stepped in to fill the gap. It's much easier to sell a vibe than a doctrine. You see this in how modern spirituality works. People say they aren't religious, but they love sound baths or meditative chanting. They are looking for the same neurological shortcut that the medieval church provided. They want the feeling of the infinite without the baggage of the ancient laws. But there's a catch. When sound replaces the gospel, the truth becomes whatever makes you feel good. It removes the need for evidence. If a piece of music makes you cry, you might assume the lyrics are true, even if those lyrics are claiming things that are scientifically impossible. This is a massive leap in logic that we take every day. We give a free pass to ideas because they are wrapped in a beautiful melody. Real-life examples are everywhere. Look at the rise of Christian lo-fi, or the way political rallies use specific types of music to prime an audience. They aren't trying to convince you with a list of policy points or theological nuances. They are trying to sync your heart rate to the beat. Once your body is in sync with the sound, your mind is much more likely to accept whatever gospel is being shouted over the microphone. History shows us that whenever sound takes precedence over the literal word, the power moves from the congregation to the performer. In the old days, the priest was the performer. Today, it's the influencer or the worship leader. The gospel used to be something you could hold in your hand and argue about. Now, the new gospel is an atmosphere. We have moved away from the age of reason and back into an age of resonance. We don't ask, is this true? As much as we ask, does this resonate with me? And resonance is purely a matter of sound and vibration. It's a physical property, not a logical one. When we let sound replace the gospel, we are essentially saying that our emotions are better guides than our intellect. For an atheist or a skeptic, this is the final boss of religious manipulation. It's no longer about proving a God exists. It's about making you feel so good that you stop caring whether he exists or not. The gospel has faded into the background, and in its place, we have a wall of noise that tells us what to believe by telling us how to feel. If we want to stay grounded in reality, we have to learn how to separate the melody from the message. We have to ask why we believe what we believe when the music stops. Because once the sound dies down, often there is nothing left but silence, and a few empty claims that never really made sense in the first place. This transition from text to sound isn't just a religious phenomenon, it's a total human shift. We are being programmed to respond to tones of voice rather than the content of speech. You can hear this in the way preachers have adopted a very specific cadence, a rhythmic, almost hypnotic way of talking that mimics the patterns of ancient poetry. It's designed to put the listener into a light trance state. You aren't analyzing the historical validity of the resurrection, you are just riding the wave of the speaker's voice. Historically, the gospel was supposed to be a rock, something unmovable. But sound is fluid. It changes depending on the room, the speakers, and the listener's mood. By replacing the gospel with sound, religion has become much more stealthy. It doesn't need to win a debate in the public square if it can just win the vibe check in your earbuds. We see this with the explosion of spiritual content that uses binaural beats or specific frequencies like 528 Hz, claiming they can heal your DNA or connect you to the universe. In a traditional religious setting or a modern concert, the collective experience of singing or humming together creates a phenomenon known as entrainment. This is where the heart rates and breathing patterns of an entire crowd begin to synchronize. For the person in the middle of it, this feels like a supernatural connection to a higher power, or a confirmation of the gospel being preached. However, in reality, it is a biological reaction to rhythmic stimuli. By replacing the intellectual good news with these physical sensations, the modern spiritual movement has effectively bypassed the need for evidence. You don't need a logical proof for God when your entire body is vibrating in harmony with 1,000 other people. Another layer to this is the loss of silence. Historically, the gospel was often reflected upon in moments of quiet contemplation, which allowed for the still, small voice of reason and self-reflection to kick in. Today, we live in a world of constant audio saturation. We have replaced the difficult silent work of analyzing religious texts with a constant stream of sacred noise. This noise acts as a buffer against doubt. If you are constantly listening to worship music, podcasts, or guided spiritual affirmations, you never have the quiet necessary to ask the hard questions. Sound has become a form of auditory armor that protects the believer from the intrusive thoughts of skepticism. It is much harder to realize that a philosophy is empty when the room is filled with a beautiful, swelling crescendo.
Building on this idea of resonance, we have to look at the actual physics of the spaces where these sounds are created. If you go back to the origins of religious history, you see that the gospel was never just about the words. It was about the way those words were amplified. In the ancient world, if you wanted to convince a crowd that you had the voice of a god, you didn't just need a good argument. You needed a cave or a temple with a specific acoustic footprint. Archaeologists have found that many ancient ritual sites were chosen specifically because they had standing waves, or echoes that would make a human voice sound like it was coming from everywhere at once. This is the first time in history where sound literally replaced the physical presence of a speaker. When the sound of a voice wraps around you from all directions, your brain loses its ability to locate the source. This creates a psychological feeling of being surrounded by the divine. In the modern world, we've taken this ancient trick and put it on steroids. We now have digital signal processing and subwoofers that can produce frequencies so low they aren't even heard by the ears. They are felt in the stomach. These are called infrasonic frequencies. Scientists have conducted studies where they pipe these low-frequency sounds into concert halls without telling the audience. The result is almost always a report of ghostly presences, feelings of awe, or unexplained sorrow. When a modern church or a spiritual leader uses these tools, they are effectively hacking your biology. They are creating a religious experience out of thin air. The gospel is no longer a set of moral instructions or a historical narrative. The gospel is a physical reaction to a sound wave. For an atheist, understanding this is like seeing the wizard behind the curtain. It takes the magic out of the experience and reveals it as a mechanical process. This brings us to the concept of the word versus the frequency. In the history of logic, a word is a symbol for a thought. It requires an agreement on definitions and a logical structure to make sense. But a frequency doesn't require an agreement. A frequency just happens to you. This is why many modern religious movements have moved away from complex sermons and toward repetitive mantras or long periods of musical soaking. The goal is to shut down the critical voice in your head. That voice is the one that says, "Wait, that doesn't make sense," or "Where is the evidence for that claim?" By flooding the brain with sound, the religious experience becomes irrefutable because you can't argue with a feeling. You can argue with a book, but you can't argue with a bass drop. Consider the role of the hymn compared to the worship anthem. Old hymns were often dense with theology. They were poems meant to be studied. They had a beginning, a middle, and an end. They were, in a sense, a musical version of a textbook. But modern worship music has stripped away the complexity. It often consists of the same 4 chords and the same 3 lines repeated for 10 minutes. This isn't because the writers are lazy. It's because they understand the power of incantation. Repetitive sound induces a state of mild hypnosis. When you repeat a phrase like, "the fire is falling," 50 times over a steady beat, the words lose their literal meaning and become a drone. This drone bypasses the logical centers of the brain and targets the emotional centers. The sound has officially replaced the gospel because the message has become secondary to the trance. This shift has massive implications for how we handle truth in the public square. If we are trained from a young age to accept feelings as truth, because of the way a song or a voice sounds, we become vulnerable to all kinds of manipulation. It's not just happening in churches. It happens in political speeches where the background music swells at the exact moment the speaker makes a vague, emotional promise. It happens in advertisements that use specific soundscapes to make us feel at home with a brand. We are living in a sonic gospel, where the quality of the audio is used as a proxy for the quality of the truth. As skeptics, our job is to develop an ear for this manipulation. We have to learn to mute the music and read the lyrics in the cold light of day. When you do that, you often find that the profound truth you felt was actually just a well-timed chord change. We also have to talk about the history of silence. In the past, the lack of noise was where people found their internal compass. But today, Silence is seen as something to be feared or filled. We have a gospel of distraction. If the sound ever stops, we might have to face the reality that the universe is indifferent to us, or that our beliefs are based on shaky ground. By keeping the sound going, whether it's through a church service, a 24-hour news cycle, or a constant stream of music, we prevent the gospel of reality from breaking through. We have traded the search for truth for the comfort of a constant vibration. One of the most striking real-life examples of this can be found in the rise of the modern gospel of the enthusiastic voice. If you listen to the most successful religious and motivational speakers of our time, you will notice they all use a very specific vocal melody. They start at a low, gravelly whisper to establish intimacy, then build to a rhythmic, percussive middle section, and finally peak at a high-volume, strained shout that signals passion. This is a vocal script that has been perfected over decades. It is designed to trigger a mirror neuron response in the listener, making you feel the urgency the speaker is projecting, even if the words themselves are meaningless fluff. In many ways, the gospel has been reduced to a vocal frequency. We are being conditioned to believe that whoever sounds the most intense must be telling the truth, a biological shortcut that completely bypasses our ability to weigh evidence or look for logical fallacies. This auditory takeover also explains why traditional quiet churches are dying while high-production, loud environments are thriving. In a silent room, your own brain is your loudest companion. You are forced to deal with your own doubts and the inherent contradictions of the faith. But in a room with a line array sound system and a professional mix, your internal monologue is effectively drowned out. The sound provides a sense of certainty that the human mind cannot produce on its own. This is why many people describe leaving a high-energy service or a spiritual retreat as a crash. When the sound stops, the belief begins to wobble because it wasn't built on a foundation of reason. It was built on a foundation of decibels. We have replaced the internal search for truth with an external source of vibration, making our worldviews dependent on a power outlet and a soundboard. We also must consider the historical shift from the communal word to the isolated earbud. In the past, the sound of the gospel was a shared physical event that happened in a specific place at a specific time. Today, the gospel of sound is personalized and portable. We can curate our own sonic reality that reinforces our biases 24 hours a day. If you only listen to voices that resonate at the frequency you already agree with, you create a feedback loop that feels like divine revelation. This is the ultimate evolution of sound replacing the gospel. It allows us to feel spiritually fulfilled and intellectually superior, without ever having to engage with a person who thinks differently. We are living in a world where we can tune out the static of reality and replace it with a high-definition, perfectly mastered version of our own reflection. Finally, we have to look at how this gospel of sound has changed the way we perceive authority. In the past, authority was found in the scholar who had spent 40 years studying ancient languages. Today, authority is found in the person with the most resonant voice or the highest production value. We are biologically inclined to trust lower, steady frequencies and rhythmic speech patterns, which is why preacher voice is a very real and studied vocal technique. It isn't about the facts they are presenting, it is about the sonics of their delivery. As we move further into a digital age, the ability to manipulate sound will only become more sophisticated. We are entering an era where the truth is whatever frequency can make us feel the most at peace, regardless of whether that peace is based on a lie. In conclusion, the gospel has not disappeared. It has simply changed states. It moved from the spoken word to the written page, and now it has dissolved back into pure sound. This sound gospel is more dangerous than the written one, because it is harder to point to and criticize. You can point to a verse in a book and say, "This is factually wrong." You can't. And that is why sound is the ultimate tool for the modern religious era. It provides the certainty of an experience without the burden of a fact. As we move forward, the most important skill we can develop is the ability to listen critically to hear the sound. Ultimately, this transition reveals a profound shift in how we define what is real. In the era of the written gospel, truth was something external that you had to measure yourself against. It was a target to be hit or a code to be cracked. But in the era of the sound gospel, truth has become entirely internal and subjective. As we become more reliant on these sonic shortcuts, we lose the habit of asking for footnotes or historical context. We are essentially trading our intellectual sovereignty for a well-produced soundtrack, allowing the vibrations of the present moment to silence the long, difficult questions of history and logic.